For this assignment, I want you to implement some of what you've learned here with functions. Let me first talk about what I want you to do, and then let me try to give you some ideas as to how to do it. So you're gonna go back to the application that you wrote where you have the circle being drawn. It's simulating a ball just jumping around in the screen. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to create a function that every time the ball bounces off an edge of the screen, it changes color. So notice right here, the ball, every time it bounces, it changes color. Now, the way it changes color is it does so randomly. So that's what I want. That's what I want you to replicate. Now, let me talk about how we can go about this, maybe give you some hints and provide some guidance. So let me restart this. That's gone now. Okay, so this is the code that we wrote for this simulation. Let me just walk you through it really quick. Once again, we have the width and the height of the window as 700 and 400. We do have this Pygame command called init. We create a clock object because we want to slow our game down. So we want to limit the frames per second. In this case, the more you increase this number here, 500, the faster that the looping happens. And so the ball looks like it's moving faster. We create a window that is the specified width and height, 700 by 400. We create the screen color. In this case, I've changed it to white. So this is all white, 255, 255, 255. I make these colors red, green, blue. For the ball color, have them all at 0, which means that these are all going to be 0, and that corresponds to black. So the ball starts as a black ball. I have the radius of the ball as 10 pixels. I have the initial X and Y coordinates of the center of the ball as half of the width and half of the height, so that the ball starts right in the center. And then this delta X is how much I'm going to move sideways after every loop, so 1 pixel. Delta Y is how much I'm going to move up after every loop, and that's 1 pixel as well. Within the while loop, I've made it so that it's always running, so this is an infinite loop. I once again slow my frames per second to no more than 500 frames per second, so that slows things down, or can speed them up if you increase the number. Fill the screen to all white. I have this ball color that I'm actually gonna get rid of. I'm gonna delete this. So if you have this line of code here where you have ball color equals red, green, blue, let's get rid of it, because it's not necessary. Ball color is initialized over here. We don't need to change it unless as a matter of fact, we will be changing it. That's part of the assignment. We have the location of the center at X comma Y. So then we draw the circle with this Pygame command, pygame.draw.circle. You specify where on the window, the color, the location, the radius, and then 0 means that the circle is filled in. And then we update our display so that we can see the circle on the screen. Finally, we increase X by 1 and Y by 1 so that when we loop back to line 28 and we repeat these lines of code, X and Y are going to be 1 unit bigger, which will move the center of the circle, and thus the circle, it's going to move it to the right 1 pixel and down 1 pixel. And then we have these checks, which was part of your assignment here. This is where we're checking to see if we've hit a boundary. In this case, this checks to see if you've hit the left or the right boundary. And then the second if statement checks to see if you've hit the top or the bottom boundary of the screen. And if you have, you're basically multiplying delta Y by a -1, so that instead of adding 1, you're going to be subtracting 1. And that makes it go in the opposite direction. Again, a review of the code. Now, what I want you to do at this point is every time that you bounce off of an edge on the screen, I want the color to change, which means that this variable needs to be updated, ball color. Now, it's only going to happen if the ball hits the screen. So you need to think about how we do that. How would you do it so that it only happens if the ball bounces off the edge? And let me get you started here. You're gonna, right above the main function, you're gonna define a new function called change color. It all has to be one word. Notice that I'll capitalize the C on the second word, which is color. This, I'll tell you right now that this function doesn't need any parameters. What it needs to do is return, and I'll write this as a comment, return 3 random numbers between 0 and 255, because that's the maximum value and the minimum value that you can use when you are coding a color. So it's 0 or 2, between 0 and 255. So you need to return that. Now, if I run this right now and I was to hard code this, return 255, then change color will always return 255. Always. We don't want to do that. So you want to generate random numbers. Let me remind you how we generate random numbers. I'll also remind you how we can return. So in this case, we want to return 3 random numbers. So how do we return 3 random numbers? And then you need to think about how you're going to implement that within your actual simulation here. So I'm going to open here a new file and just remind you here, if I define this main function, the way we generate random numbers, we can call this rand1, for example, and it will basically, we'll have to use the random library within Python or module. And then we use a function called rand int that requires 2 arguments, 0, 255, where the arguments tell you where your random number has to be between, and between 0 and 255. Now, in order for this to work, we need to import the random class or library module. I use those words interchangeably. Finally, on line 7, we'll execute the code within main. I am asked to save this, so let me just save. Let's see here. I'll just put it under fundamentals. This is actually, let me put it under functions. And we're returning return multiple values. So right now, if I run in, I don't see anything, but that's because I didn't print rand1. So if I print rand1, and now it should show up here in the Python shell. If I run it, notice I get 97. So that's a random number between 0 and 255. If I run it again, I'll get another random number. What is true is that my number will always be in between 0 and 255. And it will never be more than 255. It will never be less than 0. So that's how we generate random numbers. Now let me talk about how a function can return multiple values. So let's say that we want to define this function, which is basically, let me just, so let's just define this function that we will just call divide by 2. And let's give it a couple of parameters here, a comma b, so 2 parameters. And let's suppose that we want this function to take a and b, whatever they are, and just divide both of them by 2 and return those values. So you would say, well, let me say that this variable a divided by 2, ad2, is equal to a divided by 2, and b divided by 2 is equal to b divided that by 2. So The functionality is not of interest here. It's a very simple function. Maybe we don't see so much the purpose, but the goal is for you to understand that we can return more than one thing. And so after you divide a and b by 2, you would return a divided by 2, comma, b divided by 2. And so that's how you return multiple values. You separate them by a comma. Now, how do I test this? I can come in here and I can say, I want to run this divide by 2 function. I need to send it 2 arguments so that they can be stored in the parameter a and b. So let's say that I wanted to take 8, divided that by 2, and 10, and divided that by 2. Now, because they are going to return, this function, divide by 2, returns 2 values, I need to store that in 2 separate variables. And so I would put here something like answer 1, comma, answer 2 is equal to. Notice here the implementation. That's answer 1 will equal the first value that is returned by divided by 2, which would be this. And then I have the comma, and then answer 2 is equal to, that's why we have the equals, the second a value that's returned by divide by 2 function, which would be this. And so then I can print, just to check that this is working fine, answer 1, and I can print answer 2. And you should hope to see here for answer 1 a 4 and for answer 2 at 5, because that's what this does. It just divides each one by 2. If I run this, notice that it does indeed give me 4 and 5, which is good. So this is how you return more than one value. And that is how you store those 2 values. Very important. Now, in terms of the actual assignment here, change color, and I'll write it here to kind of give you an idea, should return 3 values. I'll call them red, green, and blue. And all of those 3 values, each should be a random number between 0 and 255, which I've discussed on how to work that out. So this should be returned. Now, when it's returned, you need to do something with it. You need to actually update ball color to equal whatever is returned by the function change color. So within your code, somewhere in your code, you need to place a call to change color, something like this. I'm not saying that it would be here, okay? Change color. It has no parameters in parentheses, no variables. That means I don't need to include any arguments within the parentheses. And it returns 3 values, red, green, and blue. So you need to store those in 3 variables. I'm gonna abbreviate them. Red, green, blue equals. Now these 3 are going to be random numbers when you execute this, and you need to use these 3 random numbers, R, G, and B, to update the variable ball color. But you need to think about where you would do that. So that's what you need to think about. When? I only want it to happen when the ball bounces off the edge of the screens. So that's the task.